No, it's not a question for Joe, actually. Although that thing you just said at the end there, what's the quote? It's talent's everywhere, access is not, or something.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the point I wanted to make was to link James with Beth and with you, because giving people who are teaching courses, vocational or otherwise, the means to say where do you get the employability skills and how do you find information out, to Bethan's taxonomy. Like I'm sitting here thinking, screen Yorkshire, screen Yorkshire, screen Yorkshire, because you're there in the middle of the Yorks and Humberside. You're there in terms of that information about what opportunities there are, what roles there are, what training there are. And if you're not, if it isn't there, it needs to be. It goes back to what I said about let's forget the turf war and what's education anyway. Let's just all make this as clear as possible and find one place where that information is available.
Or I think that's absolutely right, but I also think being able to sort of funnel it between organisations.
Well, that as well.
So looking at what Roxy did with Scratch Me, and we partnered with Film Up North, and they partnered with us, and then we've got that relationship, and then the talent, kind of the awareness of talent who are trying to come through, I think, are well known across organisations. So that work between companies and organisations, I think, is so important, because it means you can funnel it, and as you say, rather than having turf wars, as you put it,
right,
you're pushing in the same direction.
Yeah, and keep it regional.
Okay, then I think that's the end of this morning's session. So thank you very much to all our speakers from this morning. Can I just get another round of applause for everyone? Okay, so hi everyone, just in the interest of time, I'll crack on. Thanks for joining us again post-lunch. Hope everyone had some nice food and drink. So I have the pleasure of introducing today Dr. Steve Rawle, and who is the Executive Producer and Associate Professor at York St John University, and also Dr. Martin Hall, who is also the Executive Producer and Senior Lecturer at York St John University. And unfortunately they can't be joined, but their partner in crime, as it were, is Dr. Lauren Stephenson, who is also the Executive Producer and Senior Lecturer at York St John University. And Steve and Martin will be discussing and showing their amazing cost of living film. So I'll hand over to them without further ado.
Thank you. Hello, hi everybody, thanks for that introduction. We're going to show a film right after lunch when everybody's really sleepy. Everybody's eaten, I'm going to nod off a little, that's fine. So we'll just take a moment now to explain who we are in terms of the project, and then we'll go straight into showing the film. The film's just over 15 minutes long, so it's not a mega film. And then after the film, the film was a piece of research in practice, really. So after it's finished, we'll tell you what we're doing with the film in terms of how we're using it to garner kind of research information, and then I'd love to take some questions, or lots and lots of questions, because we've got quite a time slot.
And hear thoughts as well. We'll talk a bit about this after the film. But one of the things that we're hoping and we're actively doing. We're both quite tired because we were showing the film at the Hebden Bridge Film Festival this weekend. So
we did not win anything.
I'm cool with that. I know the film sort of deliberately has gaps and flaws, so that's why I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts and responses to it as well. So I think it's worth if we can bring the lights down and watch the film.
Super. Thank you. I'll get out of the way.
At least once a year, a course is held for prospective parliamentary candidates. On their shoulders will rest a great responsibility, and they appreciate the need for preparation and training. These groups of adopted parliamentary candidates have enthusiastic discussion on party policy and general national problems in an atmosphere ideally conducive to independent thought. How many points of policy have had their beginning in just such a group discussion as this?
Well, as I was saying, our candidate is pledged to help people like you. And his wife's an awfully sweet woman. You'd like her. I'm fed up with a lot of them. None of the parties seem to do anything for people like me. I agree the Conservatives have made a lot of mistakes in the past. Still, they're much better than the Reds, don't you think? I couldn't care less.
more than 400 youths take part in a night of mayhem and arson. 70 people are arrested, 50 police officers injured, some of them seriously. Dawn brings with it damage of over £1 million and demands for a new approach to the problems of our deprived inner cities. High unemployment, poor housing and rising crime mean that frustration and anger are never far below the surface.
Violent revolts grow out of revolting conditions. And I'm speaking of conditions of poverty, conditions of slums, of inadequate education.
To test our approach, we've selected 8 areas which are diverse in their character, but whose residents all share problems of deprivation and lack of opportunities.
How is £1 million going to create loads and loads of jobs? It might create 1 or 2, but that's not a lot, it's not enough.
I think before either the government or the local authority make any move, they want to come and talk to the people out on the street and find out what's really happening.
Like I read in the papers, it's 15 people after one job, so it's not worth looking for one now, is it? If I can't get one.
Every day she goes across to her local youth centre to scour the job ads in the local papers. Then it's down to the job centre to see if there's anything new there.
Sometimes I go for an interview and the way they talk to you, you feel you're going to get it. And then a few days later, you get a letter through the post and say, we're sorry, but the vacancy has been filled.
That's the way I see it. Things are bad now, but things are going to be worse in the future.
Why do you say that?
This is the way things are going on. It's like in the past, the way things have been and the way they are now. I just think to myself, if that's how they are then, what are they going to be like in the future?
And when you look at the conditions down here, they're not fit for animals, never mind human beings.
Between mice, rats, dampness, goes on like this much longer, I think there'll be quite a few who won't survive it.
Well, my house is in a terrible condition. I've got 2 rooms. I've moved out of one room because the fireplace is falling out. And now that I've moved into the other room, the floors fell in.
Well, we've never settled really, you know, since we moved into the house. We didn't realise, I think, the state that the house was. The only heating we have is downstairs. And at the moment we have no electric supply on. And we're having to move downstairs to keep the children warm.
Got them running about the carpets, on the ceiling, sideboards, everywhere.
As far as I'm concerned, they should pay us for living here. The conditions of these houses anyway.
Well, it's in a shocking condition. I mean, we have no water, no bath. I mean, I have to go down dark stairs.
Do you know why the flats were built without facilities?
I don't know. It must have been a maniac that built them because they weren't built for children and families, that's a fact.
It's a terrible area. There's no facilities, nowhere for me band to play.
You can't keep kids in all the time, but it seems that you have to in an area like this, because whenever you put them out to play, there's danger in all directions.
We shall not be moved.
Well, just how desperate is it for
2 local swimming baths closed, with plans for the new ones shelved, a park with 1 swing in it. Now, is that not desperate?
There was nothing that further could be done through normal sort of channels. The government seemed to produce this consultative document but say, well, sorry, you know, we're not going to implement it now, which is ridiculous.
Everybody understands that we have to economise in local government spending. Education is the largest of those spenders. We went through every item on which we could economise and decided that this was one of them. And I think it may well have been the right decision, but the council has now decided otherwise.
We presumably see this as a victory for the ordinary man and woman against bureaucracy.
Justice, I think, is a better word.
think environment has a lot to do with people. If there's a bad environment, people could turn like their environment. Now, I know that many of these people have been rehoused in the area, and their homes are now like little palaces.
The first families moved in. Homes for 6 new communities have been built in the 4 cities.
The New Jerusalem, an island of advanced development in an old country, as famous as Rome or Paris, the Venice of the North. These are the words of the politicians, and they've all been applied in recent years to the city of Newcastle. But can one, by taking thought, by building tower blocks, pedestrian overpasses and shopping precincts, can one, by these means, actually make people happy?
I don't like being right up ahead, and I don't like the high buildings and that, because I'm too lonely. It's really lonely. These flats, you don't see a soul. Going in or out, you don't see a soul, nor hear of soul.
They're all on top of each other. Durham Prison. I call it Durham Prison. Just needs a few bars up the windows and then we'll land it.
I think a lot of the problems that we have to face at the moment are to do with the breakdown that we've seen in community life. And I don't mean simply family life, but community life in general.
And I think now you've got to go out of your homes and you've got to go to places to make friends more.
Every week I get the number 6 bus to Clumber Street, now just across the road. I like to come down to Wash House because you've got no bother at home.
Fine, thanks.
I see still old faces and we'll have a bit talk, and it seems to buck you up when you come down again and talk to your old friends and that.
Yes. Have you heard about your new house yet? Not anything yet.
I don't think I'll go into business again, not on my own account. I don't think I could afford to, because if you take a shop on these new estates, the rents is fantastic, the rates is fantastic.
It's always very sad to see fixtures and fittings being sold to the highest bidder, but an all too common sight nowadays as businesses start to feel the pinch.
First thing motorists noticed on their way to work today was petrol going up. Most garages didn't waste a minute adding 10 pence to the price of a gallon.
Well, thousands of calls asking who is open for the supply of petrol, but more to the point, we've had hundreds of people ringing in, can they rescue us, we have run out of petrol.
And every housewife will soon be counting the cost of the budget. Shopping bills will still rise.
Do you think then the government ought to subsidise food prices?
Well, sometimes yes, I think they should. You know, because the prices are rising too much.
Because with the prices going up, you just can't cope with the prices. I'll make do without during the week in order to be able to get 3 square meals at the weekends when the Ben's at home. I can't budget any more than I'm doing. I'm doing without so much already. The Ben doesn't go out anywhere, there's nothing for it.
Do you still find any difficulty paying your gas bills?
Well, this time I will, because the gas is all going up.
Yes, it is.
This time I will.
And how will you cope with it?
I don't know.
How are you going to manage to pay it then?
Couldn't tell you. I've got to have half the money pulled together for tomorrow.
And how will you manage that?
I don't know.
And everybody's got the fuses out, you know, so we don't use the steam heating at all, that's obsolete. I've just got an electric fire. And I use just my electric fire, my ordinary household lighting, television, and just me water, you know, just ordinary water heater.
You're all electric. Do you think you could make any economies, Mrs. Anderson? I mean, can you cut down on heating bills?
We have cut down. We have.
How can we keep our electricity bills to the bare minimum?
Well, 3 points, right? First of all, switch things off when you're not using them, whether it's lights or fires or whatever. Secondly, take a hard look at your electrical equipment, like those lights we saw in the kitchen, which you can replace with other lights, just as efficient, but perhaps the most important thing that you should do is not use electricity for heating either rooms or water if you have some other way of doing it. I suppose if you worked at it hard, you might save a quarter to a third on your electricity bills. There's a very useful booklet here, produced by the Department of Energy. Compare your home heating costs, and you can get these pamphlets for nothing from the Department of Energy, Staingate House, here in Newcastle. I'm sure they'd be very pleased to let you have a copy.
Do you think your pension is adequate enough to cover?
Well, I don't know, not the way the prices are going. I mean, if the prices are going to rise, I think that we ought to have a rise of our pension.
I mean, it's fine for people that have got 3 or 4 wages coming in, but we're widows. We're just on widow's pension. Well, what can you do on that when you have mortgage and rates and things to pay?
Having no home means sacrificing relationships, not being important to anyone, in fact, a loss of identity. If this is a social problem, the iron fist is no answer. These are people. They feel unwanted, they feel unloved.
After serving your country, how do you feel now about the way in which life is treating you?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, I've got no time for the country, the way we are being treated. Because if I didn't steal, I would go into malnutrition. And I'll not die with malnutrition. You can bet on that.
Soup and bread is not much to provide for people who have so little. But a sense of community is achieved here in the open. It's a social occasion.
Got another cup. There you are.
How does it feel to be homeless?
Terrible. You know, I never thought it would happen to me. You know, terrible, really.
Families come to our office from all over Leeds. They come mainly seeking the material aid that we have to give them here. We give families enough food to last them overnight when they should be able to get help from the Social Security.
It's not just enough to say, here's a bed. Let's really recognise that these people are human beings, and we've got to try and instill in them again a sense of dignity so that they can start facing themselves again.
What does it mean to you when you've got a place like this to come back to every night?
Oh, it's great. I've got security, and that means a hell of a lot to me.
I think England can take a look at America, so to speak, and avoid some of the problems that have developed there. Because I think there are similarities, and through strong legislation vigorously enforced on the housing question and on the job question as well as on the school question, England could avoid many of the dark nights through which we have passed in America.
Sorry, I was going to go turn the lights on, but I think we can all see each other, can't we? Saves me a walk.
Super, thank you. Yeah, so we thought we'd just tell you why we made the film and what we're going to do with the film, and then take thoughts and questions as much as you like, as long as time allows, of course. So I represent, with Lauren Stephenson, who couldn't make it today, the Cinema and Social Justice Project from York St John University. And we established ourselves in response to a study in the humanities report that said in the last 60 years, the percentage of students at universities studying the humanities has gone from around 29% to about 8%. So obviously, I mean, I'm in film studies and we're in the humanities, Steve's in media production, and they're in the School of the Arts at the moment. But, you know, we're just thinking about this notion of studying the arts and the humanities holistically. So in response to that, we thought, well, why? Why is that the case? Why are people not coming to us? And evidently we're ever so slightly biased, and we think, you know, the major questions and major issues, the really important things we're talking about at the minute, Trans Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter, these really important socio-economic questions. We think film is a really great site through which to educate people about those things, and a really great platform for people to use to share their own voice, their own identity, their own message. So we're obviously trying to champion the notion of film. So it's part recruitment, part research. What we've done with the film, we've taken it into FE settings and we've shown it to students and we've surveyed them using a Qualtrics survey, and we've got the data from that survey information, and we're going to produce some findings about the effectiveness of film to affect social change. And so one of the things we've done is to take it into education. One of the things we've done is we've submitted it to film festivals. As we say, we were in Hebden Bridge and Bristol Radical Film Festival and Manchester Kino and Crystal Palace and many others, hopefully. And we're surveying those audiences too, and obviously they're quite distinctly different audiences at the film festival. In fact, at Hebden Bridge, we could talk about that in a moment, couldn't we? The audience, you know, spoke on behalf of themselves as a very specific kind of audience, which is quite illuminating, I think. So we're doing that, but alongside this, one of the things we're also doing is a filmmaking competition. So it might not have been super clear from the image that all of the footage there was taken from the Yorkshire and North East Film Archive. So the YFA is a charity that are based on the York St John campus. So we spoke with Graham Relton, the archive manager there, and said we took him a brief and said we want to make a film about socio-economic injustice. We're particularly interested in housing and heating and food and fuel. And so he looked through something like 200 hours or more of footage and kind of got this big pile, and we went through them all and we digitized a load of them, and then we chopped them all together with Andy. Andy Burns did a phenomenal job of editing it all together. So all the footage is from the Yorkshire Film Archive and or the North East Film Archive. So it's all regionally specific footage. So obviously with Sign being kind of the Yorkshire industries, the Yorkshire area, we're trying to keep it in that kind of vicinity just out of interest. But we're going to move the film beyond the boundaries of Yorkshire and the North East shortly as well. So we put the film together from archive footage, we're taking it to students, we're making a filmmaking competition for FE students where we're going to facilitate them. One of the things we see with the YFA, and you see in the film as well, is that because it's historical footage, the footage is part amateur footage, enthusiast footage, not amateur footage.
Yeah, you'll make... Graham's not here.
Graham corrects me on that one usually. He's not here, so it's amateur footage, really. And also like newsreel and some short docs and things like that. But obviously the kind of ramifications therein are that who had access to cameras. So it's very white, it's very straight, it's very male, it's very middle class. All the footage in the archive, almost all of it. We did our best with what we had. So the filmmaking competition the intention is to plug those gaps. And so we want to put cameras into the hands of young people and also facilitate them to use their own cameras, telephones and things like that. And with the filmmaking competition, the footage they produce will then be archived in the YFA and kind of strengthen the collection and kind of lots and lots of other things. And the Sign project is the film. And the Cinema and Social Justice project is slightly broader. We're producing an educational resource of film. It's about film, really, but about texts that we could use to teach social justice in cinema. And we want to eventually kind of affect change with regards to curriculum design and maybe speak to what the kind of A-level boards are setting. One of the things we looked at is, and I'll stop right after this, there's a really interesting organisation in the US called Open Syllabi. I don't know if anybody's heard of it. Yeah, a really fantastic idea. They've got the syllabi from universities and HE institutions from over 140 countries, and they produced some really interesting stats, and particularly with film studies, they made this bar graph of the most set filmmakers in film education. And number one was Hitchcock, and there were 3 women in the top 100. One of them is Leni Riefenstahl. That's okay. And the 2 people of colour. And so we're thinking, okay, we need to start at education and have more people on that list. And when they are high on the list, how many films are being set? Like Spike Lee's on there, but it's 1 film. No prize for guessing which. Hitchcock, there's like 30 films, and how we can engage with that. Okay, do you want to say something, and then we'll move on?
I think you've pretty much said it all. So I think one of the things that we are asking, we don't have any survey data or conclusions to share with you today. We're still in the process of collecting information. We've got some more schools to go and visit, or we're bringing some of them to our campus to talk to them and share the film and talk about that. So we don't have anything definitive to show other than the film, which has been, it's been an unusual journey. I think one of the things we've been talking about documenting is the process of taking this film around different audiences, coming out of academia. I mean, I think we were asked this weekend, why don't you take the film out of academia? And it's like, we're at a film festival. I don't think this is academia.
It's on YouTube.
It is on YouTube as well. So sharing the film has been an experience in itself and engaging with different audiences. But part of the survey data that we are collecting, I was just talking to Jude and James outside about some of the things that we've been talking about, some of the things that came out. I was one of the organisers of the Screen Education Symposium at York St John last year, about whether we're teaching a subject that kind of maps across production and studies, whether we are delivering solely to those who want to work in screen industries, or whether they are just interested in the creative, political and aesthetic ideas of film or television or media more generally. I think those boundaries are breaking down as we're talking to students as well. We're having to ask them, what is a film? How do you see a film? Do you see it as just the thing in a cinema, but you can go and see National Theatre at the cinema? You watch most of it digitally in exactly the same way you look at short form content. So how do they understand film in that sense? Do they understand it as an industry or as a different set of industries? So one of the things we are surveying on as well is what do you understand as a film? What do you understand as content? And fundamentally, I think, which is interesting for this setting, is we're also asking if those students have aspirations to go on and work in screen industries. Whether that is through working on high-end content, or whether it is about engaging with stories like these that are perhaps more relevant to them, because I'm conscious this is lots of other people's stories, and whether through engaging with social justice issues or issues related to their own identities or their own socioeconomic place in the world, they can tell those stories, and that is a way of hooking into their creativity, which is what we want to do with the film competition, which is sort of slightly sketchy. I mean, it's probably ironic that a film that ends with protest and strikes was sort of delayed a bit through quite a bit of strike action. So, I mean, that's just another one of those connections in the films, which is kind of uncanny sense of deja vu for that. I mean, that's quite deliberate, but becomes more timely the further we get away from having made the film. So understanding, brilliant, that the people we're showing the film to, because of conscious, one of the things we've actually, I think, struggled with is showing the film to students other than media and film students who are sort of already the converted. Film festivals are already converted. I think you're probably converted as well. So trying to get beyond that into kind of other educational sectors has been a little bit tricky for us. So hopefully, I mean, maybe next year we're here and we're sharing some of the conclusions from the study that can feed into some of the pathways that come out of today later. Yeah, we're under 5 minutes, so any questions or? Sorry, do you want to?
No, you
questions. This is an okay forum for comments as well.
Are you looking at this kind of just beyond, because sort of weirdly, I'm not from film and screen industry background, but I'm an urban geographer and I work in areas that are around social justice. So for me, the important part wasn't the mechanics of it, it was the storytelling, this obviously telling the story. So with that in mind, are you looking to kind of just really just take it out as a piece of storytelling with historical footage?
I think so. I mean, one of the things it's sort of snowballed in a way, because we intended it as this kind of research resource. We wanted to say, can film affect social change? Here is our example therein, and this is how we might suggest one could affect change with film, and then survey a response to that. But the film seems to stand on its own as a film and has been taken on, and so that's why it's in film festivals. There was kind of a call for it. We did go to them eventually, but it kind of took on a life of its own, and I appreciate that it exists as an artifact of storytelling, and in particular kind of histories of stories. And I do think it needs to exist on its own, so that's why we've put it on YouTube as well. Certainly in terms of social justice, we wanted it to be free. We didn't want it to be gate-kept in academia and behind paywalls and stuff.
And we launched it on the World Day of Social Justice, 20th of February, wasn't it? And around that as well, we had a series of local, regional and national press. The Big Issue covered it. We variously appeared on BBC and ITV talking about it. What's been very interesting as well is the sort of the film aspect once it's covered in certain areas. You know, the Sunderland Echo, we're interested because it's got footage of Sunderland, so we're Newcastle. So was the Yorkshire Post, you know, so very specifically focusing on the local aspect of the storytelling in it, which again is another, we didn't intend that, and it's just, I mean, it's partly testimony to how interesting the film is, and the work by the editor. Yeah.
It was really good, I love it. I come from a background of distribution and exhibition before I went into training, and short film is my thing. I've watched that without any background to what you've done, and I would have watched that going, the brief is to make something using archive footage as a statement of today and the society that we're in. So I'm afraid that I'll blame it on the post-lunch kind of slump of cards. I don't really get what you're trying to do with it. So for me, and that's maybe the difference is I'm kind of echoing what you're saying, that I understand it as a piece of film. I don't understand it as an academic thing, what you're trying to achieve from it. Mm-hmm. And I know you've explained that, but can you just... So who actually made it? Graham obviously produced it, you exec produced it.
Yeah. So Andy Burns works at the YFA, he edited it together, so in effect.
So you didn't have a director? Did you have a
No, there was no director. We did a kind of mood board planning session together as four of us. This is what we want the images to be centred around, the kind of topics, the ideas, and the geographies as well. And then siphoned through because the footage at the YFA is just a room full of film. Exactly. It's just stuff. And we just kind of watched it all, and there's some of it's catalogued with terms like, homelessness and housing and stuff, but very little of it is. And we found all the images, and you're right, we tried to speak to today with the archive footage, but the kind of use of it in terms of our interest was, how can we think about today? How can we, the idea of it being a catalytic call to arms to people, and not necessarily to get out and strike or protest.
Just a bit, I'm slightly struggling.
Yeah.
I suppose as a piece of filmmaking, I think it stands alone, and I think that's the thing that you probably subsequently found.
Yeah, that's right.
That wasn't the intention. And I think it's really interesting from that perspective. What is it exactly, and this is going to show my ignorance, are you researching from this? This is the bit that I can't get around.
Our opening question when we work with students with it is what is a social justice film?
Okay, all right. But there were no students involved in this.
We are taking it to students as a conversation piece, as a discussion. What we ultimately want to do is inspire further storytelling.
So it's a provocation.
It is a provocation. That's a perfect term for it.
Yeah, we did have a student on. We had a student researcher, one of our undergraduate students, who helped us go through the footage. So,
that's great.
Speaking about his.
We have two further working on the project.
Yeah, and more as well, more students. There are a lot of students involved, sort of behind the scenes, as it were. And what was interesting is Matthew, the student researcher, really wanted loads of footage from Leeds because he's from Leeds, and so his voice, I do think, is in this. You kind of need to know Matthew. I'll introduce you. Have we got time to take more questions? One more.
Yeah.
So,
it was more on you're wanting to take this out as a bit of a competition. If there's young people that we want to take this out to, or places that we want to take this out to, how could we get access to that information? Because you're wanting diversity of voice in YFA now.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'd
yeah.
love to see more people that look like me on there, you know, in the future. So I'd just be curious to learn how.
Well, when we have a website, and we're approaching colleges just in our area only because of geographical ease, but we will reach out to people, and we've got a Cinema and Social Justice website. There's a Twitter account, and we will share stuff via Sign and online. And if people have educational settings that they would like to be involved, with us, we'd love to sort of partner up.
So we're based up in Gateshead and Sunderland, so
Yeah.
we work with a lot of the FE colleges and secondary
Perfect.
schools up in that area. So yeah, happy to.
That'd be amazing. So the filmmaking bit's like the next step. So we're just putting plans together for that. So that would be amazing. Let's connect if that's okay.
That'd be fantastic. Yeah.
Well, we're going to call it there. Sorry.
Okay. No.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cool. So thanks everyone. Thanks for everyone's questions and discussion and everything. So next up we have another two amazing sessions to choose from. So in here in the main room we've got Dr. Cassie Kill from the University of Leeds with her session Producing Passions, Entry-Level TV Production Traineeships as Diversity Work. Or if you'd like to move to the breakout room, we have Play Your Way into Production, which is thinking about gamification with Professor Jude Brereton from the University of York, Andy Campbell and others from One-to-One Development Trust. So if you'd like to move now, that would be fab. We'll start again at 2:20. Thank you.
I'm going to be talking a little bit today about my research with a wonderful team of researchers at the University of Leeds, where we're looking into entry-level TV production traineeships. And I'm going to be talking about that today in terms of the idea of diversity work. Our research was supported by Science, so it's really great to be here today with you all. So, for a number of years, there's been an awareness that there's a lack of diversity in British TV production. And often, action has been taken to address that at the entry level. There are lots of traineeships in the sector now which claim to target groups that are considered to be underrepresented in the sector. And while these schemes are commonplace in the sector, there's not necessarily been huge amounts of research into how they're taken up or what they do for those who've been involved in them, whether that be the participants or the production companies. And also, we've not always looked in any great detail at what happens beyond the schemes. What do people go on to do next? How do they take them up? And what challenges do they face once they begin their career in the sector? So I was really interested today to think about how we might understand those schemes as a form of diversity work. And I'm thinking about Sarah Ahmed's use of that term here, and I'll talk more about that as things progress. And to learn more about how trainees grappled with their experiences of the schemes and of their careers beyond that. So our study has examined one traineeship in detail using interviews. So we were interested in questions like what sorts of notions of diversity were embedded in the logic of these schemes, what does the traineeship scheme do for different sorts of trainees, and how do trainees respond to this kind of complex landscape of affordances and limitations that they might experience in the scheme and the wider sector beyond that programme. So we interviewed current trainees several times over the course of their experience of the programme, and the research is ongoing, so we're still doing that. And we wanted to generate insights into what the scheme involved, what trainees learnt about the sector and about themselves from taking part. And we also interviewed past trainees, so people who'd done the programme, you know, a year ago, 2 years ago, 7 years ago, to find out what they learned from being part of it and how they integrated that into their accounts of their careers over time. And then we've been coding those interviews to generate themes and learn from those. So one of the questions that we asked really early on and have continued to return to is, how is workforce diversity understood in the TV production sector? And what do the nature of these schemes tell us about that? And really what affordances and limitations to these understandings of diversity offer in the schemes? So I would argue that the prevalence of these entry-level schemes, that there are quite a number of them now, suggests that the lack of diversity in TV is understood as a threshold issue. And what I mean by that is this idea that the problem is that we're not getting a diverse enough mix of people in So if we open the door and let people in, then the problem will be solved. That follows in that line of logic. However, I would argue that limiting our thoughts about the issue of diversity to a threshold issue stops us thinking about these larger structural issues in the sector that produce a set of working conditions. Those are much harder and more complex to address. So I'm not saying there's not a threshold issue, but there is. What I'm saying is that's one part of a much bigger and more complicated picture. And I'm going to talk then about what the affordances and limitations are of just thinking about that issue in such detail. And that's where I think Sarah Ahmed's work is particularly useful as a way of thinking about inclusion, diversity, and how we might queer the use of a sector and of a workplace as a way of thinking about those affordances and limitations. And this is something that's come up a lot today, actually, which is really interesting. Maybe trying to think about going beyond simplistic ideas of enfranchisement or empowerment, thinking about this more nuanced picture. I was interested to hear a few people say we need to think with more nuance, we need to think optimistically but also critically, and that's something that we're really keen to do too. So yeah, thinking about how trainees respond to the scheme and their wider careers in the longer term. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Sarah Ahmed's work here because I think it is such a powerful, practical framing. Some of you might have seen Sarah launching her new book in Leeds last week. Sorry, unfortunately I couldn't get here for that. But I'm just going to talk particularly about her ideas on queer use now. So sorry, this picture's quite poor quality, but it's a picture that Sarah's used to talk about intended functionality. So she's got this picture of a post box with a sign on it saying, "Birds nesting, please do not use the box, many thanks." And she says that, speaking to this image, that intended functionality can mean who something is for, not just what something is for. The post box has become a home for nesting birds. Of course, the post box could only become a nest if it stops being used as a post box. Hence the sign, "Please don't use," addressed to would-be posters of letters. Sometimes a change of function does not require a change of form. The birds use the small opening intended for letters as a door, as a way of getting in and out of the box. And she continues, "I'm aware that this is a rather happy or hopeful image. To queer use, to open up spaces to other users and uses usually requires more than just turning up and turning a postbox into a nest or a room into a shelter." And I think that image really speaks to questions of workplace diversity and some of the challenges involved in doing that. So she produces this alternative piece of signage, just going, "Birds welcome," and says, "Diversity is this sign. Birds welcome, or more typically, minorities welcome. Come in, come in." That sign would be empty of force if the postbox was still in use, as the birds would be dislodged by the letters, the nest destroyed before it could be created. She continues, "Just because they welcome you, it doesn't mean they expect you to turn up. Those deemed strangers can be welcomed as a way of not modifying an existing arrangement. What's material to some, leaving you with no room to breathe, to nest, to be, can be what does not matter to others because it does not get in the way of their occupation of space. It might even enable that occupation." And I think this metaphor speaks really powerfully to a number of the challenges of doing diversity work in the TV production sector. So, as I've said, our study's ongoing, but with that wonderful framing, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the emergent results that we have so far. So firstly, the offer of these kind of entry-level production schemes, this is kind of what's put out there by the sector. And the traineeship that we looked at talks about targeting people underrepresented in the industry, including deaf and disabled people, ethnically diverse people, and people from lower socioeconomic groups. And it specifically targets people with very little professional experience of TV production. The promotion of that scheme described it as a way to break into TV, which really kind of resonates with that thinking about or feeling about TV production traineeships as addressing a threshold issue. And there were lots of lovely glossy images, as you'd expect, of beautiful young people of different ethnicities smiling and laughing, which feeded into this sort of optimistic image of that programme as fun, diverse and social. A number of the trainees we spoke to talked about having taken part in promotional events, both online and in person, where they were able to have a go at making content. Some of them had never done that before. They were able to meet previous people who'd been part of the programme, which again was really inspiring for many of them. And they got information and advice about how to apply and were encouraged to do so. And for some of them, just learning that regional TV production was a thing was really powerful. So one person said, when I applied to the scheme, I didn't at that time think that I would work in TV. It didn't seem like something that I would ever, it sounded like some sort of intangible thing. It doesn't sound like working in TV was a real, possible or plausible career path to me. So when the scheme came, I was like, oh, I didn't know they did things like that. And what I liked about it was literally the fact that it was based in the area that I grew up. Because I also felt like with industries like that, my assumption was that it's in London or somewhere like that. You'd have to move. I didn't know it was possible to do that kind of thing in the Midlands. It sounds silly now that I think about it, but at the time it was like, they do that here? Like, what? So for some of those young people, just finding out that this was something that existed where they lived was really powerful. It was also really powerful to hear that there was this opportunity to have a 12-month paid role, and that kind of job security was a really important counterpoint to those often unpaid and extremely precarious routes into work that we've heard about throughout the day. So one person who didn't have a kind of secure family home to return back to said, I saw the training scheme, and because I didn't have a home to go to after university, it was a really, really big thing for me to be able to get a job and pay the bills and stuff. So that offer was really, really powerful for many of them. So I'm going to talk a bit now about the affects of application, so how people felt about it and what that kind of invoked for them, this experience of applying. And there's an established body of research now that indicates that the cultural industries are generally perceived as this kind of meritocracy, and that young people approach these careers with an often kind of euphoric belief in their own success. They may not be that engaged with the complex realities of the labour market that will be required to kind of succeed. And several trainees that I spoke to, current and past, talked about thinking the programme would offer a kind of golden ticket. That exact phrase came up many times. And that then they get into this successful career in TV. They talked about the fact that getting any experience, even unpaid, had been completely impossible for them before. And that it was only possible to get in through family connections. So for them, it just seemed like this golden ticket would solve all of the problems and then they'd be in. So they had a lot invested in that experience of applying. And considering that, I think it's understandable that application invoked this really complex series of feelings for many of them. So one ex-trainee talked about the experience of competing with other applicants for a particular placement opportunity that she wanted. And she said, I was just fully in the zone, like manifesting my destiny. So if someone said they wanted to do that, in my head, I didn't say this out loud, but in my head, I was like, sucks to be you, because I'm going to get it. Like I was going in with that level of self-assuredness. Like, I know there's no one better to take this place than me. I just felt like I knew how competitive it was going to be, and I didn't want to be fazed or made to feel small by anyone. So I was just trying to like fake it till I make it. And she continued, you hear about, nepotism babies that have things handed to them, and they have no experience, but they act like they do, and they have all this authority. I was trying to channel that when I was going to my assessment days, but I was obviously nervous. And another trainee talked about a similar sentiment, and in terms of this difference between self-confidence and self-esteem that she articulated, which I thought was fascinating. And she said, I think black women do suffer from being very confident because you kind of have to be the one to bolster yourself up because the rest of the world isn't going to do it. But in relation to self-esteem, your self-worth of who you are, it's often very, very low because of the constant beatings by society, whether they be in really subtle ways or really overwhelming ways. I kind of had to feed my own ego to survive and kind of wear it as a shield of armour. But no matter how much confidence you have, if you don't have that self-esteem, the self-belief in yourself, it's like a really messed up relationship. So what was really interesting to me about these feelings that people had around applying as these kind of underrepresented groups was that it was often sort of building this very individualised ideas about their own success in their careers, that it was about talent or effort or their own personal kind of, going back to that idea of a meritocracy, which didn't necessarily fully engage with the kind of complex systemic issues that were being expressed there by that young person. So there were a number of really amazing affordances of the programme. As I mentioned before, the fact that it was a 12-month programme, it was paid, allowed people to skip over some of that precarity, and certainly allowed access to TV careers to some people who would never have been able to do that otherwise. The training that was built into the programme was often described as fun, built young people's confidence and sense of professional belonging in certain areas. So women gaining camera skills allowed them to often feel more competent and at home in the workplace. The opportunities to make lots of networks and build contacts in a short period was also really valuable. And some trainees talked about maintaining relationships initiated during the scheme for many, many years afterwards. Really interesting to me was the fact that the peer support network of other trainees within the cohort was really powerful for a lot of people. So that was a way in which these people, as underrepresented workers, formed sorts of solidarities and support networks for each other. So they were able to provide ongoing support with their marginalisation as their careers progressed. So that was both practical and emotional support that they offered and took up from each other as a kind of wider professional friendship group. So there were also a number of limitations of a scheme like this, which I guess goes back to what I said at the beginning about the fact that we can't expect these kind of entry-level schemes to solve the wider problem. So placement experiences were sometimes really challenging for trainees when they encountered the realities of the sector. This often included a real lack of diversity in the workplace. So one young person of colour described being introduced to a black colleague who was much older than them and they had very little in common with professionally or otherwise, and eventually realising that there'd been an assumption made that because they were the only two people of colour in the whole company that they would just somehow become friends, and how uncomfortable that was for them to realise that that assumption had been made. There was also a whole set of discomforts for these sort of diverse trainees around the kind of content they were producing, whether it was content that was not itself very diverse or representative, feeling uncomfortable about being the one to make those suggestions about how to diversify the content being made, which was not always taken up, or on the flip side, being asked to be the voice of diversity in terms of the sort of ideas that were being brought to the table, which was clearly a much bigger problem than one trainee could be expected to deal with. The strenuous working conditions of TV production were really challenging for people with forms of invisible diversity, so mental health needs, disabilities, chronic health issues. And workplaces weren't always prepared to make adjustments for needs of people within the placement or in work beyond. So some trainees were told they shouldn't be taking breaks or not given access to flexible working procedures. And one trainee said it felt like they weren't prepared for me in the workplace, which I think really harks back to Ahmed's idea that, you know, just because people welcome you in, it doesn't mean they're there expecting you to turn up or prepared to make accommodations for what you might need when you get there. So sometimes these kind of experiences led to a sense of feeling like trainees have wasted an amazing opportunity or let people down in the workplace. Many had internalised the ideas I mentioned before about their success as an individualised matter. They weren't kind of taking up these practical insights about some of the systemic issues that were affecting their experience of work. And that was really emotionally challenging for people to feel like they'd been given this golden ticket, but it hadn't solved all their problems. So beyond that sort of landscape of, or I guess within that landscape of limitations and affordances, I've been really interested to hear some of the amazing creative responses from workers and trainees about how they've taken up the scheme and dealt with their career beyond. So one trainee talked a lot about being part of this message group for people of colour who've gone through the programme, saying this had supported them practically and emotionally over a number of years. And that was a sort of safe space, as they described it, where they could ask for advice without fear of being judged as incompetent. They were offering each other work so they could collaborate within these more diverse teams. And they were also turning to this space to share stories and get support when they were dealing with racism and discrimination at work. So that was a really powerful kind of way that they took up what was on offer to them by the scheme in a kind of creative way of finding solidarity. Some of the trainees and ex-trainees talked about taking action in their workplace to do what I would think of as diversity work. So whether that could be all sorts of diverse things. So one person talked about setting up a film club for Black History Month. And somebody else was part of helping the production company she'd worked for improve their EDI policy. So all really important things, but actually the experience of doing those things was often also draining and oppressive. So they weren't necessarily being paid for any of those things. They weren't necessarily having those their efforts being rewarded or taken up by other colleagues around them in the way they'd hoped. And other trainees were really creative in forging complex careers as a way of coping with the pressures of a sector that they loved and desperately wanted to be part of, but which wasn't actually hospitable to their needs. So working freelance across a number of different sectors, or working in sort of non-traditional routes through a media career to get beyond these kind of issues of strenuous, long work hours, high-pressure jobs that weren't accommodating to them. So, that gives you a bit of a whistle-stop tour of where we're going and what we've got so far. And I've kind of put conclusions with several dots there, because there are many of them and they're ongoing and unending, really. But yeah, just to give you a kind of overview of what I think this research is telling us so far. Despite the idealised sentiments about being part of these schemes, the realities of the sector were, of course, complex and challenging for young workers. And although most trainees were absolutely delighted to have had this opportunity, there were arguably some ethical issues with the experience for some of them, because they were often left feeling like a failure if they weren't able to thrive in the sector. So whilst I would say that entry-level training schemes have many affordances for those who take part, they can't solve the issue of diversity in TV. And this goes back to something right at the beginning about this idea of critical optimism. You know, we can be hopeful and we can try and challenge the barriers we've got, but let's not be over-optimistic and stop paying attention to the problems that sustain beyond them. And the reason that they can't solve it is because they don't address the material and cultural systemic issues in TV production. This is perhaps especially pertinent as regards the excluding realities of working conditions for many people with both visible and invisible forms of diversity. But let's attend to the creative things that trainees did do, the solidarities, sense of community they took up, and the attempts they made to support sector change, how they took up the offer of the scheme and in their career beyond. The next steps for us are to speak to staff in the production companies who are welcoming trainees and to hear about those experiences professionally of what that was like for them and how prepared they felt like they were and what would support that to improve in future. And I think, as perhaps just a note to the future, although I definitely don't claim to have any grand solutions at this stage, production companies and training providers could certainly learn from both Sarah Ahmed and some of those trainees' voices that I've mentioned today, to consider how they prepare for diverse trainees, to seek ways of being actively hospitable to difference rather than just inviting people in without making any change to working conditions and practices. I want to thank the rest of my research team, because it's definitely been a big ongoing collaborative effort, and also thanks again to Sign for supporting this research. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I think that was fascinating. I was really keen to just learn a little bit more, because you said that, you know, there weren't even the basic workplace adjustments that were made, particularly when thinking about disability, when, if you think about it, that's now law. And I'd be keen to understand from the staff perspective, is that something you're going to explore in terms of what they think is happening or is not happening? Because it is actual legal requirement, and obviously diversity has to go beyond that, but at the very bare minimum there are legal requirements.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also interested to hear about what staff have to say about that, and you know, why it's not happening. Because I agree, yeah, it seems like perhaps that isn't even meeting the bare minimum. I have the same questions. Do people know that they're breaking the law? You know, why is it that is such a compelling kind of narrative? I was actually really interested to see the report at the front that had been previously commissioned by Sign about this kind of disposition of gratitude in TV and media production, which I think really can sit at odds with being hospitable, because workers are so conditioned from, you know, before they ever, many steps before they ever get to the workplace, to feel like this is such a golden ticket, we're all so grateful to be here, that you know, then is perhaps at odds with people asking for what rights they need.
It's almost like an invisible social contract that they're signing. It's almost like an invisible social contract that they're signing then with their employers, I would imagine, that just prevents them from asking for what's basic right, I suppose.
Although saying that, some of them certainly did ask for it quite loud and clear, and it was kind of told, you need to earn your place here, and it's crunch time now, and we all need to kind of knuckle down and get things done. And I'm not blaming kind of individual kind of, maybe I'm blaming some individual workers in production companies, but I think there are wider systemic issues beyond the individual. There's pressure on small independent production companies to get things done in a certain way, in a certain time, within a certain budget. So it's a complex problem to solve, I think.
Any other questions? Mine's just a comment really linked to that, actually. Mine's just a comment linked to that, or an observation.
Yes.
You said it, it's the word small, isn't it? How many of those independent production companies have got dedicated HR? You know what I mean? Is it a skills gap within the sector? Actually.
Yeah.
And that is the case I work in the creative culture sector, and that's the case for many of the small companies that I work with. They just haven't got dedicated HR.
Yeah.
Large organisations have, but not the smaller ones. So not necessarily...
Yeah.
They're just aren't aware and haven't got the time to implement.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think that's why it's important to recognise it as a structural and systemic issue, and to think about where does that come from. And what I'll be really interested to hear from the staff really about, do they feel like they know how to be accommodating to diverse workers? Do they know what's expected of them by law? Are there issues around how they are commissioned which make it really difficult to work in these more accessible and accommodating ways? It came up in some of the presentations earlier today about these kind of the routes and career paths that people take as they get more senior. Maybe they haven't had the training that would enable them to understand, what's expected. So I agree, it's really complex, and that's a really important part of it.
I'm interested to know then, in conclusion, are they a good thing or not?
It's a good question. I think I would say I would really, really resist reducing it to that binary, because I think...
If you want money, so I'm a funder.
Yeah.
So do I carry on funding this sort of stuff or not?
Well, I would really, really advocate for funders taking a more nuanced approach to who they fund and why. So thank you for asking the question. I think they are good. They have some affordances and they have limitations. So fund with an awareness of the complexity of doing it and doing it well. And I think also that, that need to kind of say, I think there's so many issues with how funding happens in the cultural sector, which I could talk about all day. But I think often the issue of competitive funding, those structures, make it very difficult for people to talk about failure. I know Leila Yankovic at Leeds has done some great work around this. It means that people can't actually say, this bit didn't work, this bit was compromised, we can't do this and this at the same time, we can't do everything in one really small scheme. And people end up just saying everything was amazing, and it's that kind of uncritical optimism that stops people noticing these kind of complexities and contradictions in actually doing stuff.
Anyone else? Super interesting, everything today. I'm just really curious what was offered by way of maybe mental health support or kind of like reflective practice to help them process their experiences on set and those more challenging moments, and also that kind of, the bit you said about the golden ticket and like I've made it now, and processing like actually what, if this isn't the moment that you quote unquote made it, what does that mean for your career longer term? There's a question in there somewhere.
Was it about what kind of reflective practice opportunity? Yeah, it's really difficult for me to know, because the thing I would have loved to do, which we weren't able to so far, was to observe the training happening. So as someone with an ethnographic background, I would have loved to be in there experiencing it and hearing about what trainees were told to expect of the workplace, and then along the way through the programme how they were able to reflect with their kind of tutors and mentors at the training provider about that, because I imagine some of that did happen, but I'm only hearing about it from the trainees reflecting back, which, has limitations. And sorry, what was the second part? It was about how then do they deal with the golden ticket not quite working out?
I guess kind of about, the disappointment maybe, like managing that and the challenges that maybe they experienced to their mental health as they were going through that process and like landed in that work experience environment. Yeah,
I mean, there's a lot of literature out there about that in academia, about the kind of optimistic attachments that we often have to these kind of narratives about what our futures are going to hold, especially under late neoliberal capitalism, how we sustain our attachments to that. I think that was really challenging, and some people did really struggle with their mental health. Some people did find it a golden ticket, and despite being part of an underrepresented group, had absolutely thriving careers that would be understood as successful in a whole range of ways. I think some people probably completely left the sector. Those people are really hard to find because they don't tend to talk about the fact they did this traineeship on their LinkedIn if they're now doing something totally different. So that is perhaps a limitation of our methodology. But yeah, sorry.
Hi, I work at the NFTS, National Film and Television School, and we're finding more and more with kind of bespoke training programs that we're being asked to do, that we're actually building that resilience training. Is it off? Sorry.
It keeps going off.
Oh, I need to reconnect.
And I know we can all hear each other. So
Sorry, I'll just say that again. So what I was saying is that we're being asked more and more to do bespoke kind of training programs, and it's always EDI. It's around, which is great. But we are finding continuously that we're now building in resilience training. We have pastoral support, so that every single thing that we do has to have all those things. Has to do all those things, because obviously it's the problems around it. It's not as simple as going, as you say, here's the pathway, here's the yellow brick road, you just need to follow it. It's about addressing all those surrounding problems that are there, or the barriers that have put someone in a position that they're not able to walk into the industry. And it's not always just about money, although that's usually the biggest one. But there's so many different things. And so we can do the basic training, but those other wraparound things have become have become equally important, I'd say, in the schemes that we're running.
I mean, I think that the notion of resilience is a really complex one, because, yes, of course, like that young black woman talked about, if you're constantly being beaten down by society, she was talking about having to have this kind of internal narrative where she's bigging herself up and putting herself back out there. But that hadn't been a healthy experience for her. Throwing herself back into a sector and a world which was kind of putting her down had created this really kind of complex set of harms, I would say, in many ways. So, again, it's affordances and limitations. It's perhaps a good thing to try and help people cope with those harms, but also I think an awareness of the fact they are structural harms is also a really powerful thing.
Anyone else?
Oh, I've just got a microphone right.
Last chance.
Right, okay, well, thank you so much, Cassie. That's absolutely brilliant. And you've rewarded us all with an early cup of tea.
Well, I like to do that.